A drunken man shoved a girl onto a stranger's porch and tried to sell her for coin. What happened next would change both of their lives forever. The evening sky hung low with heavy clouds, the last bit of light slipping behind the ridge, when Jonas opened his cabin door. The day's labor still clung to him, the smell of pine and sweat mixed with sawdust, and he had expected only the usual quiet of the woods. Instead, he found a man standing crooked on his porch, shoulders bent and reeking of whiskey, his breath sour as the wind that rushed down from the mountain. The man had one hand clamped on a thin girl's arm, shoving her forward like she was nothing more than a sack of grain. Her hair was tangled, her dress wrinkled and stained, but her chin was set high, her jaw locked, and though her eyes shone in the dim light, she refused to let tears fall. Jonas stood still, leaning one hand against the doorframe, his broad figure filling the doorway. He said nothing, only took in the picture before him, while the man spat words like he was spitting tobacco. "She eats too much, cries too little, and ain't worth keeping," the uncle muttered, his eyes darting between the girl and Jonas, his voice carrying the sharp edge of shame disguised as anger. He pushed the girl again, and she stumbled forward but caught herself before falling. She stood with her arms stiff at her sides, her back straight, as if daring the world to break her. Jonas noticed that, the way her feet planted firm, even as her uncle dragged her forward, and something in the silence of it struck him. The man rubbed his unshaven jaw and held out a grimy hand. "Coin," he said, his tone flat and ugly. "Give me coin, and she's yours. Else I'll leave her here anyway, and wolves can do what they will." Jonas looked at the man, then at the girl, who still did not move except to pull the blanket of her own pride tighter across her shoulders. She had no shoes, her toes raw and red from the dirt, yet she did not flinch. Jonas reached back into the cabin, pulled a small leather pouch from a shelf, and without a word dropped it onto the porch rail. The man snatched it quick, the coins inside clinking like a cruel song. He did not look back, only staggered into the night, muttering curses under his breath as he disappeared down the path. The woods grew quiet again, save for the faint crackle of the fire Jonas had left burning inside. The girl stood where her uncle had pushed her, not turning, not speaking, her eyes fixed on some place beyond the trees. Jonas did not ask her name, did not ask where she came from or what had brought her here, because the truth lay plain enough in the stiff set of her shoulders. He stepped aside, motioned once toward the warmth of the cabin, and she moved past him slowly, her steps careful but steady. Jonas closed the door behind them, the sound heavy in the small room, and the bargain of silence hung between them like the night itself. The night settled heavy over the clearing as the man's footsteps faded into the dark, his curses swallowed by the trees and the smell of whiskey still hanging in the air like a sour ghost. Mara stood where he had left her, thin arms wrapped around herself, though she would not let them tremble, her lips pressed tight until they were almost white. She had learned long ago that crying only made her uncle's hand heavier, only made his voice crueler. So she kept her face still and her chin raised, daring the world to see weakness where there was none. Jonas leaned against the porch rail, the leather coin pouch gone with the man who had traded flesh and blood for drink, and the silence between them was deep enough to hear the creek running through the trees. He said nothing, just reached behind the chair by the door and pulled out a folded wool blanket, rough but warm, and held it out toward her. Mara stared at it for a long moment, suspicion sharp in her eyes, as if she expected it to be snatched away the moment she reached for it. But Jonas did not move, his hand steady, his face unreadable in the dim light. At last she took the blanket and clutched it close, but she gave no thanks, no nod of acknowledgement, and still not a single tear slipped down her dirt-streaked face. Jonas watched her a moment longer, then pushed the door open wider and stepped aside. The fire inside the cabin cast a glow that spilled out into the night, warm against the chill, and after a pause, Mara stepped across the threshold, her bare feet silent on the wood. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of pine pitch and smoke, the walls lined with shelves of tools and jars, and the big timber beams catching the firelight. Jonas shut the door behind them, and the sound seemed final, as if closing out not just the night, but the man who had left her there. Mara stood near the hearth, the blanket wrapped around her thin shoulders, her eyes darting from the heavy axe propped in the corner to the rough-hewn table to the narrow bed against the far wall. She said nothing, only pulled the blanket tighter, waiting for orders or blows or the kind of words she knew too well, but none came. Jonas stirred the pot that hung over the fire, the smell of beans and salt pork rising, and ladled a portion into a tin plate. He set it on the table and pulled out a chair, then returned to the fire without another word. Mara did not move at first, uncertain whether the food was truly hers, but hunger gnawed louder than doubt, and at last she crept forward and sat stiffly, spoon in hand, eating in quick, quiet bites. Jonas did not watch her, only worked the log he was whittling, the steady scrape of his knife, the only sound besides the fire. Mara's throat ached with each swallow, not from the food, but from the tears she would not allow. And when the plate was empty, she sat back with her lips pressed tight once more, the blanket around her like a shield, and the silence of her refusal filled the cabin as sure as the fire's glow. The cabin held the smell of pine sap and wood smoke, the walls dark with years of heat and labor, the small windows letting in little more than the last trace of twilight. Jonas crouched near the fire, stirring beans that simmered in a blackened pot, the rhythm of his movements slow and steady, like a man who had spent his life working with his hands. Mara sat in the corner, the wool blanket still around her shoulders, her back pressed against the wall as if distance alone might protect her. Every muscle in her body was pulled tight, her eyes sharp in the shadows, waiting for the strike that always came when her uncle's voice rose, waiting for the command that would remind her she was not her own. Jonas did not raise his voice, nor did he look at her for long. He set a plate on the table, filled it with beans and a scrap of salt pork, then pushed it across the rough wood so it rested closer to her side. He did not speak, did not insist, only nodded once before returning to the fire. Mara hesitated, her lips pressed thin, her eyes locked on him, testing whether it was some kind of trick. But Jonas had already turned back to his work, cutting more kindling, his broad shoulders outlined by the glow. Slowly, Mara rose from her place, the blanket trailing at her feet, and sat down at the table. She gripped the spoon tight, her knuckles white, and ate quickly, her gaze never lowering, as if showing weakness would undo her. The beans were hot, the pork tough, but to Mara it tasted of something she had not known in weeks, warmth that came without cruelty. She kept her face blank, forcing herself not to reveal how much she wanted more, how her body soaked up the food like dry earth drinking rain. When the plate was clean, she pushed it back, her chin still high, daring him to see her hunger but not her shame. Jonas gave her a glance, no more than that, and poured another portion without a word. The fire popped and shifted, throwing sparks against the stone hearth. Outside, the wind carried the howl of a coyote, distant but sharp. Mara flinched at the sound, her fingers clenching around the edge of the plate, but Jonas only reached for another log and set it across the flames, the crackle filling the silence. His calm was strange, almost unsettling, yet it carried no threat. Mara waited for the moment he would demand her service, waited for the words that would reduce her to less than human, but none came. He simply ate his portion of beans, wiped the plate with a crust of bread, and set it aside. The firelight danced across the cabin walls, and for the first time in years Mara felt the faintest ease of her body loosening, though her face stayed guarded. Jonas leaned back in his chair, his knife in hand, as he carved at a block of pine, shavings falling to the floor. Mara watched him in silence, her eyes unblinking, and when he finally looked up, she did not turn away. The days stretched long beneath the mountain pines, the air filled with the steady thud of Jonas's axe and the groan of logs dragged from the forest floor. From dawn until dusk his work never slowed, his broad back bent against the saw pit, his arms moving with the rhythm of a man who had long ago learned to live by muscle and silence. Mara lingered at the edge of the clearing, the wool blanket never far from her shoulders, her bare feet growing tougher each day as she paced the line between forest and cabin. She did not speak, and he did not ask her to, and in that quiet a strange rhythm began to grow, one that held neither cruelty nor kindness, only the certainty of two lives brushing against each other without demand. She watched the way he swung the axe, the blade biting into pine with a sharp crack that echoed across the clearing, watched how he leaned his weight into the saw as he worked, steady and patient, never once cursing the wood when it split uneven. Her uncle had cursed everything, from broken tools to spilled water, his voice always sharp and his hands quick to strike. But Jonas kept his silence even when the work fought back. Mara found herself waiting for the outburst that never came, for the flash of anger that would remind her she was unwanted. But day after day, the quiet held. When he came back to the cabin at dusk, sweat streaking his shirt and sawdust clinging to his beard, Jonas washed at the basin, ate from the same pot of beans they shared, and sat by the fire with his knife and a block of wood. He carved shapes without naming them, the small curl of shavings falling at his boots. Mara sat across the room, her knees pulled to her chest, and the silence wrapped around them both like another blanket. It was heavy at times, pressing against her chest until she wanted to scream just to hear sound. Yet it was not cruel. It did not crush her with scorn. It did not bruise her ears with insults. It simply existed, and in that space, she began to breathe a little easier. At night, she listened to the creek outside and the soft rustle of the trees, and in those moments, she thought of her uncle's words, the way he had called her useless, too stubborn, too strange. She thought of how he had said no one would ever want a girl who refused to cry. Yet here she was, in a cabin where no tears were demanded of her. And though Jonas said little, his silence did not mock her. It simply allowed her to be. On the fourth evening, she caught herself staring at him as he mended the handle of his axe, the firelight catching in his hair. He noticed her watching but did not speak, only nodded once, as if to say he saw her and found no fault in her presence. For reasons she could not name, her throat tightened, though still she kept her eyes dry. The mornings came crisp and cool, mist lifting off the creek, while the forest stirred with the sound of birds and the steady chop of Jonas's axe. Mara began to move with more purpose, no longer clinging to the edges of the clearing like a shadow, but stepping into the work that filled the long days. She gathered small sticks scattered across the ground and stacked them by the cabin wall, her thin hands brushing away dirt and bark. When she carried armfuls of kindling to the porch, Jonas did not stop her, did not scold her for getting in the way, only gave a brief nod, as if to say he noticed. That single gesture struck deeper than any word of praise, for it was the first time she felt her effort counted for something. She swept sawdust from the floor when he came in from the pit, the broom nearly as tall as she was, her strokes uneven but determined. The smell of pine clung to her hair, and when she looked up to see Jonas watching from his chair, she tensed, ready for the mocking tone she knew too well. Yet he said nothing, only went back to whittling, the curls of wood falling soft to the floor. It puzzled her, this silence that did not wound, this allowance that felt almost like trust. By the third day she dared more, fetching water from the creek in the wooden pail, her bare feet slipping on wet stones, the weight of the water dragging at her arms. Halfway back across the clearing, her knees buckled, the handle biting into her palms, and the pail nearly tipped. Jonas was there in an instant, his hand closing firm around her elbow, steadying her with a strength that left no room for insult. He held her upright, just long enough for her to catch her breath, then released her quickly, stepping back as if to give her space. Mara gripped the pail tighter and walked on, her heart thudding not with fear, but with something she had no name for, something that felt almost like respect. That night she lay awake on the small cot he had cleared for her, the wool blanket tucked around her shoulders, and thought of how strange it was to be treated as if she were not a burden. Her uncle had always made her feel like dead weight, too much to carry, too much to keep. But Jonas's quiet nods, the way he let her work without pushing her aside, planted a small spark in her chest. She realized she wanted to rise before the sun, wanted to fetch more wood, wanted to try again with the pail until her arms no longer trembled. The fire burned low in the hearth, shadows stretching across the rough log walls, and Mara touched her sore palms, feeling the sting of blisters forming. Instead of shame, she felt a strange kind of pride, as if the ache in her hands proved she belonged in this place. She closed her eyes with the sound of the creek still in her ears, and for the first time in years she drifted to sleep with no fear of what morning would bring. The rain came heavy that night, pounding against the roof with a steady drumbeat, slipping through the cracks of the shutters and carrying the smell of wet earth into the cabin. Jonas had brought in extra wood before the storm, stacking it near the hearth, and the fire burned bright enough to chase back the damp. Mara sat at the table, her hair damp from fetching water earlier, her blanket draped around her shoulders. She kept her eyes on the flicker of flame, listening to the hiss of rain as if it might drown out the weight that always pressed on her chest. Jonas moved about the room in his quiet way, the scrape of his knife against wood the only sound besides the storm. She had grown used to that rhythm, the endless carving, the steady fall of shavings on the floor. Tonight the air felt different, filled with something she could not name, a heaviness that made her sit straighter, as though waiting for something to break. Jonas finished his work and set down a small shape on the table in front of her. Mara blinked, her hand twitching back in surprise. It was a whistle, carved from pale wood, smoothed by careful fingers, its surface shining faintly in the firelight. She stared at it, as though it were a trap, something that might turn cruel the moment she touched it. Jonas said nothing, only nudged it closer with the edge of his hand before leaning back in his chair. Mara's fingers trembled as she reached out, the wood warm where his hands had shaped it, and she lifted it as if it might vanish. Her throat tightened, her breath catching in her chest, and without warning a single tear slid down her cheek. She gasped and wiped it away quick, angry at herself, pressing her lips together hard until they hurt. She would not cry, not here, not in front of him. Crying had never saved her, had never softened her uncle's grip or lessened the sting of his words. Tears had always been weakness, proof she could be broken, and she had promised herself long ago she would never give him that satisfaction again. Yet the whistle in her palm, simple and small, carved with no demand attached, had split something she had thought was sealed tight. Jonas did not look startled, did not press her with questions or speak her shame aloud. He only said 2 words, his voice quiet, steady as the rain. "Keep it." Then he turned back to the fire, feeding another log into the flames. Mara sat frozen, the whistle clutched in her fist, her chest aching with a storm that was not outside but within her. She wanted to shout, to demand why he had given it, to ask what he expected of her, but no words came. Instead, she sat with her eyes dry, forcing the storm back, refusing to let it spill again. Still, she could not ignore the shift inside her, the crack that let in the smallest light, the first proof that maybe not all gifts were knives in disguise. The trail to town was muddy after the rain, the wagon wheels sinking deep, and the horses breathing hard against the weight of fresh-cut lumber. Jonas walked beside them, steady as always, his long strides eating the distance without hurry. Mara followed close behind, her thin dress brushed clean that morning though the hem was already streaked with dirt. She had begged silently to be allowed to stay at the cabin, away from the eyes she knew would turn sharp. But Jonas had motioned for her to come, and so she did, her chin lifted, though her stomach twisted. When they reached the edge of the settlement, the air changed, filled with voices and the clang of hammers, with the smell of smoke and tallow and the faint sweetness of bread from the bakery. Mara's chest tightened as heads began to turn. Men leaning against the saloon rail narrowed their eyes. Women carrying baskets slowed to whisper, and children tugged at their mothers' skirts to point. The sight of her trailing Jonas like a strayed dog lit curiosity, quick as dry grass, catching fire. "She ain't his kin," a voice muttered clear enough for her to hear. Another hissed back, "Then what is she?" A third laughed, low and cruel. "Trouble, if you ask me." The words pressed into Mara's ears until her skin burned, yet she kept her chin high, her eyes fixed ahead on the wagon, determined not to let them see the sting. She had lived her whole life under stares like knives. She thought she had grown used to it. But here, walking behind Jonas, she felt the weight more than ever, as if their judgment were not just for her, but for him too. Jonas did not turn, did not break stride, did not answer a single word. His silence carried through the street heavier than a shout, his broad shoulders cutting through the whispers like an axe through bark. He loaded the lumber as though no eyes watched, as though no tongues wagged, and the more they whispered, the calmer he seemed. Mara clung to that, though part of her wished he would say something, wished he would name her aloud so they would know she was not just a cast-off, wished he would defend her where all could hear. But he did not, and somehow the quiet strength of it struck deeper than any defense could have. As Jonas finished with the wagon, a woman by the mercantile leaned close to her companion, whispering loud enough that Mara could not mistake it. "A girl like that brings nothing but shame." Mara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stand straighter, the blanket of pride she wore as armor pulled tight across her shoulders. She refused to cry, refused to shrink, but inside their words burrowed like thorns, each one lodging deeper until her chest ached. When at last Jonas turned to leave, he looked back once at her, his gaze calm, not questioning, not pitying, simply steady. Mara fell into step beside him, the whispers still chasing her like shadows, but with each stride, his silence grew larger, drowning them out. By the time the town was behind them and the forest swallowed the road again, she realized that his silence had been an answer after all. The sun had barely dipped behind the ridge when the sound of stumbling footsteps broke the calm of the clearing. Mara had been gathering sticks near the cabin wall, the smell of supper drifting from the fire. When she heard the slurred voice she knew too well, her heart turned to stone inside her chest, her hands stiff at her sides as her uncle staggered from the tree line, his face red from drink, his eyes glassy with greed and anger. He swayed but managed to point a crooked finger at her, his words spilling out sharp and ugly. "She's mine, and I want more coin for her, else I'll drag her back where she belongs." Mara could not breathe. The air itself felt thick as mud. Every cruel word from her childhood came rushing back. Every blow, every night spent staring at the ceiling, afraid to move. Her feet rooted to the ground, her eyes wide though no tears would fall. She had taught herself too well how to refuse them. Still, her body trembled at the sight of him, her uncle's presence clawing at the small piece she had begun to find. Jonas rose slowly from the chopping block, where he had been sharpening his axe, his broad shoulders catching the last light of dusk. He lifted the axe, not in anger, not as a threat, but with the natural weight of a man accustomed to steel in his hands. His face was calm, his eyes steady, his steps measured as he crossed the clearing until he stood between Mara and the man who claimed her. "She stays," Jonas said, his voice low, quiet as the wind through pine needles, but heavy as stone. The words left no room for bargaining, no room for doubt. Her uncle sneered, spit landing dark in the dirt, his mouth twisting in disgust. "She ain't worth your trouble. She's nothing but a curse, a mouth that never gives back. You'll see. You'll regret keeping her." He staggered closer, his boots crunching on the dry earth, but Jonas did not move back. He did not raise the axe, did not shout, only stood solid as a wall, his silence louder than the storm of threats. Mara's chest tightened, her breath shallow. every muscle aching with the need to run, yet she could not move. She watched Jonas's back, broad and still, watched the way he stood without fear, and for the first time in her life, someone else bore the weight of her uncle's rage. Her throat burned with words she could not say, with gratitude she could not voice. The uncle spat once more, muttered something about trouble and payment, and finally turned, swaying back toward the shadows of the trees. His figure melted into the dusk, his curses fading with him, but his promise lingered in the air like smoke. Mara's knees gave slightly, but she steadied herself, clutching the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Jonas lowered the axe and set it aside, returning to the block as if nothing had passed. The clearing fell quiet again, but inside Mara the silence rang different. She had been claimed once in cruelty, but this was something else entirely. A defense that asked nothing in return, and it shook her more than any blow ever had. The fire burned low that night, its glow soft against the log walls, shadows stretching long across the floor. The storm in Mara's chest had not eased since her uncle had staggered from the clearing, his promise of trouble still heavy in the air, his voice still ringing in her ears. She sat at the table, with her hands clenched tight in her lap, her back stiff, though her eyes fixed on the flames as if they alone might steady her. Jonas sat across from her, his chair tilted slightly, his head bent over a block of wood, and his knife working in slow, steady strokes. Neither had spoken since supper, the silence pressing so thick it seemed to choke the room. At last, Mara's voice broke through, soft but sharp, trembling though she tried to make it strong. "Do you know why I don't cry?" She stared hard at the fire, her words spilling like water from a dam. "Because tears never saved me. They never stopped the fists when they came down. They never filled my stomach when I was hungry. They never softened his words when he called me nothing. Crying only made it worse. So I stopped." Jonas's knife stilled. He did not lift his eyes, only let the pause hang heavy before setting the block of wood aside. He leaned forward, resting his broad arms on the table, his head bowed slightly, as if the weight of her words was something he would not take lightly. Mara's throat burned as she spoke, her voice rough, low, and fast, as if she feared stopping would mean she could never begin again. "I told myself if I never cried, then he couldn't break me. If I kept my face hard, he couldn't see how much it hurt. But every time I held it in, it felt like I was turning to stone inside. And I thought maybe I'd stay that way forever." Her voice cracked at the last word, her breath hitching, and for the first time her body shook, though she fought to keep it still. Her hands trembled against the rough table, and she gripped them tighter, nails biting into her palms, furious at herself for letting even that much slip. Jonas did not speak, did not tell her to hush, did not dismiss the pain she carried. He only reached across the table, his hand rough from years of labor, and laid it gently over hers. His touch was steady, not heavy, not demanding, but sure, like the pines outside that bent with the wind yet never broke. Mara felt the heat of his palm against her knuckles, and for a moment the stone inside her chest cracked again, the hardness she had carried so long giving way just enough to let the trembling come. Her lips pressed tight but her eyes blurred, and though no tears fell, she felt them pressing hard, waiting. Jonas bowed his head lower, his silence holding her words, as if they mattered, as if they were worth carrying. And in that stillness, for the first time, Mara felt the weight of her sorrow lighten, not gone, but shared. The night was quiet until the wind shifted and carried with it the sharp scent of smoke. Mara had been dozing lightly, her ear tuned as always for danger, when the smell pulled her upright. She rushed to the door, her heart hammering as she saw the glow through the trees, orange flames licking higher than the pines. Jonas was already on his feet, his boots hitting the dirt before she could call his name. By the time she stumbled outside, the crackle had grown fierce, and sparks danced against the dark sky like angry stars. The lumber stacks Jonas had spent weeks cutting were already ablaze, the fire eating quick through the dry wood, snapping and roaring with hunger. Jonas grabbed a bucket and ran for the creek, his movements sharp and certain, and Mara followed without thinking, her own hands closing around another pail. The smoke stung her throat, burning her lungs, but she did not stop. Together they hauled water back and forth, dousing the edges where the fire tried to creep closer to the cabin walls. Jonas shouted once when a beam fell, his voice hoarse but steady, and Mara obeyed without hesitation, throwing dirt where the flames flared, beating sparks with her blanket until her arms ached. The fire raged like a living thing, fed by the wind, reaching for everything they owned. Each time Mara thought it would win, Jonas drove forward again, his broad frame outlined in firelight, his determination like an anchor that pulled her with him. Her arms shook, her chest burned, but she kept pace, coughing until tears blurred her eyes, refusing to drop the pail no matter how heavy it grew. The night seemed endless, a cruel test carved in smoke and flame, but neither gave in. When at last the sky paled with the first gray light of dawn, the blaze began to die, beaten back by water and earth. The stacks blackened to smoldering heaps. The cabin stood dark but whole, its roof charred at the edge yet unbroken, the porch still upright though streaked with ash. Jonas leaned against the chopping block, his shirt soaked with sweat, his breath coming hard, his face streaked with soot. Mara sank to her knees in the ashes, her arms hanging limp, her lungs dragging in ragged air that tasted of cinders. She pressed her palms into the blackened ground, the heat still rising through her skin, and whispered the words that had lived in her chest since the night her uncle sold her. "I'm not going back." Her voice was cracked and hoarse, barely more than a rasp, but it carried with it every shard of defiance she had buried. She did not look at Jonas when she said it, did not need to, because the words were not for him, they were for herself, a vow spoken into the smoke and morning air. Jonas straightened slowly, his eyes fixed on her through the haze. He did not answer, only gave a single nod, his silence holding the weight of her promise as steady as the cabin that still stood against the fire. The days after the fire were marked by the smell of charred wood and the endless work of clearing away what had been lost. The lumber stacks were nothing but blackened heaps, the ground scarred where the flames had licked at the soil, but the cabin still stood, and that alone felt like a victory. Jonas wasted no time in setting to work, his axe swinging steady from dawn to dusk, the rhythm of the blade against pine echoing through the clearing. Mara followed close, her hands blistered but eager, no longer content to stand back and watch. She gathered the broken pieces, stacked what could still be used, and hauled the smaller logs into piles, her body aching but her spirit rising with each task. Jonas began to show her how to handle the axe, his big hands guiding hers on the worn handle, his voice low as he told her where to place her feet and how to let her weight drive the swing instead of just her arms. At first she struggled, the axe biting shallow, bouncing back and leaving her cheeks hot with frustration. But Jonas never mocked her, never scolded, only placed another log before her and nodded for her to try again. Each strike rang sharp through the air, each blow stronger than the last, until at last the wood split clean down the middle. Mara stared at the two neat halves, her chest swelling with a pride she had never known. The days stretched long, filled with work that left her sore and bruised, yet she welcomed it. She fetched water from the creek, balanced the heavy pails across her shoulders, and though her arms trembled, she no longer stumbled. She swept sawdust from the floorboards, mended small tears in her blanket, and even learned to patch the roof where sparks had left black marks on the shingles. Each new task Jonas gave her felt less like a burden and more like a place carved out just for her, proof that she belonged to something solid. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the air smelled sweet with sap, Mara stood with sweat on her brow and hands raw from work, staring at the neat stack of firewood she had split on her own. Jonas passed by, carrying a log under one arm, and gave her a slow nod. The same steady gesture he always gave. Yet this time, it made her throat ache. She was no longer just a mouth to feed, no longer coin passed from one hand to another. She was part of the work, part of the place, woven into it as sure as the pine trees that ring the clearing. That night she sat by the fire, her arms heavy but her heart light, and listened to the steady scrape of Jonas's knife against wood. She thought of the ashes still lying beyond the cabin, thought of the fire that had tried to take everything, and realized that from those ashes something new had been built, something stronger than before, something that felt like home. The seasons turned in slow circles, the harsh bite of winter giving way to the soft thaw of spring, the heavy rains of summer soaking the earth before the sharp winds of autumn swept the leaves away. Through it all, the cabin stood stronger, its roof patched, its walls firm. The clearing around it opened wide with stacked wood and steady work. Mara's hands had grown calloused, her arms steadier with each swing of the axe, and though her frame was still slight, she carried herself with a strength that showed in every step. The girl who had once stood barefoot on the porch, lips pressed tight against tears, now walked the clearing as if it belonged to her as much as it did to Jonas. She learned the rhythm of the land, how to tell when rain was coming by the curl of the clouds, how to plant beans so they would take root in the rough soil, how to snare rabbits in the underbrush without wasting bait. Jonas showed her in his quiet way, guiding without pressing, his silence still heavy, but no longer strange. In that silence she found space to grow, and in her growth she discovered pride. The whispers from town still echoed faint in her memory. Her uncle's threats lingered like smoke, but the weight of those voices no longer bent her shoulders. She had built something here, and it could not be traded or burned away. One evening the lantern burned on the table, throwing its golden circle of light across the cabin walls. Jonas sat with a beam laid across his lap, the blade of his plane moving in slow, even strokes, the wood curling away in thin ribbons that fell to the floor like shavings of paper. Mara sat nearby, the blanket around her knees, though the air was warm, watching the steadiness of his hands, the patience in his work. She thought of the years before, of fists and hunger, of nights where her worth had been measured in coin, and the words pressed at her lips before she could stop them. "Home," she whispered, her voice small but clear, carrying through the room as if it had been waiting all this time. Jonas looked up at once, his eyes steady on hers. He did not smile, did not speak, only gave a single nod, his face calm as the pines outside. Yet in that nod, she felt the weight of everything they had endured, the fire that had nearly taken them, the hunger they had outlasted, the scorn they had borne side by side. She knew then that they were not master and ward, not rescuer and burden, but two souls bound by survival, and something deeper that needed no name. Mara let the words settle in the quiet, feeling it spread through her chest, soft and certain. The cabin walls creaked in the night wind, the lantern flickered, and Jonas's knife scraped once more across the wood. And for the first time, she believed the truth of what she had spoken. This place, this man, this life, it was home. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.